Everybody in here, and everybody watching us, joining us on our online study. Glad you can be with us. It's our last Sunday in this church year, calendar year, and so we're about to move into 2024. We've already been talking as we started class about finishing up a year and starting a new one. It always leads to some new thoughts and beginnings and resolutions. Everybody will have those going. We already talked about that a little bit too, and because we did all that eating over Thanksgiving and Christmas, and now we got to do something about it. But anyway, finishing up our church year here, and so our last lesson for 2023 is called the first murder. We've been working through Genesis, and before last week's lesson, which was around the birth of Christ, we had made our way through the fall with the story around Adam and Eve and their decision to rebel against God, and then the punishment that came from that. That was back in chapters 2 and 3, and as we walked through that and looked at the announcement of the punishment that was going to come to them, and also to Satan, and actually the punishment went to Satan first. And so just to get us back to where we were, I'm going to read from Genesis 3 and 15, because this verse in particular is the very first promise found in the Bible. And it sets the stage for everything that's going to come afterwards, the rest of the Bible, the rest of the Old Testament for sure, and leads into the New Testament. So that verse reads, I will put hostility or enmity, whatever translation you might have, I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. And so we went through that verse and how it applied to the promise from God towards Adam and Eve, towards Satan. And it was a direct statement and a blunt pronouncement of how that relationship was going to be from that moment forward. There was going to be a fight, a conflict between the Adam's seed, or the woman's seed, and the serpent's seed from then forward. That's what we're going to look at today as we see how this applies to what came afterwards. So that first decision to rebel and put them in a state of sin, it shows us where this all begins. And today we look at what comes afterwards. Some days go by, of course, you can see, and then we get into what we're going to study today, Cain and Abel. So go back to chapter 3, and I'll start around verse 20. Let's read a little bit. The man named his wife Eve, because she was the mother of all living. The Lord made to clothe them from the skins for the man and his wife, and he clothed them. Remember, they had tried to cover up their sin with fig leaves, and instead God made skins for them. This is where the first sacrifice of an animal came into play, because the fig leaves weren't going to do the job. There had to be a blood sacrifice. A life had to be sacrificed to pay for that sin, and this is where we see that first blood shed. So in verse 23, so the Lord God sent him away from the garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken, and he drove the man out, and he stationed the cherubim and the flaming whirling sword east of the garden to guard the way to the tree of life. Remember, that was to send them out of the garden so that they would not be able to get to the tree of life and be stuck in a state of sin for eternity. Now, chapter 4 is where we start today, and we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at this event between Cain and Abel, and we're also going to look at how that started a chain reaction and a line that maybe you never had researched like this before, but we're going to look at, time permitting, that line and how that fits into Scripture. So let's start with verse 1, chapter 4. The man was intimate with his wife Eve. She conceived and gave birth to Cain. And she said, I have had a male child with the Lord's help. And she also gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel became a shepherd of flocks, but Cain worked the ground. And in the course of time, Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but he did not have regard for Cain and his offering. Cain was furious, and he looked despondent. So let's catch up. So it says that Adam and Eve had a son named Cain, and then they had another son named Abel. Cain was older, of course, and so Cain became a farmer, said he worked the ground. And Abel was a shepherd, and so he tended sheep and goats. And so it says, over this time, in the course of time, and I've heard different commentaries this week on what in the course of time would mean, but it just means kind of a broad general definition is as they grew up and as they matured and got to a place where they understood what a sacrifice was. And so even though sacrificial offerings weren't kind of legalized until Moses, they still understood what sacrifice was, because Adam and Eve had to watch God kill an animal and make skins for them. And so they understood this sin caused the death of this animal in order to pay for this sin. Okay, so now it says, in the course of time, they brought an offering. Where did Cain and Abel learn how to do this? From their parents. All right, so Cain brought an offering, and Abel did too. It says that Cain brought some of the land's produce as an offering. Abel brought an offering too, and he brought some of the firstborn of his flock and the fat portions. So they both brought an offering. And it says here that the Lord had regard for Abel's offering, but he did not have regard for Cain's offering. And a lot of people have a problem with this part. They say, wait a minute, both of them brought something to God. They both understood we need to bring something to God. But the problem that we have here is that Cain's offering was bloodless, and Abel's offering involved the sacrifice of a life. So even though Cain brought some of the produce that he had grown, it wasn't the same. And it tells us, even though it's not written in Scripture, it tells us of the attitude of Cain. He didn't have the same attitude towards this offering as Abel did. For Abel to bring his offering, he had to take an animal's life. And for Cain to bring his offering, all he had to do was pick up some turnips and pull some plants and bring them. He brought some produce. It was easier. And so for Abel to bring his offering, it required a sacrifice. It required him to go through the motion of taking a life and shedding some blood of an animal in order to bring it to God. So it tells us how much of a deeper commitment Abel had to have towards this offering and sacrifice. Well, it says here that Cain was furious. That was his reaction. And it says he looked despondent. So his countenance fell, pretty much. He was just sad, depressed. He was upset about it. But the furious part is what we ought to take note of, because instead of coming towards God with an humble spirit, he came with the opposite. It was as if, here, there's some offering. I did my part. And with Abel, you could tell, because of the offering that he brought, it was much more emotional and much more committed. Okay, so let's go to the next verse 6. I think that's a 6. Can't see good. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you furious, and why do you look despondent? If you do what is right, won't you be accepted? But if you do not what is right, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Now, when I read this, just because we've studied the New Testament so much the last year, and the life and time centered around the disciples with Jesus, I couldn't help but think about Peter when he is trying to talk to Jesus and telling him, no, you're not going to be sacrificed. We're not going to have you down on the cross. And Jesus had to tell him, get behind me, Satan. Because Peter, if you remember, Jesus said, Peter, Satan is trying to sift you. He's working on you. He's trying to tempt you. And if you let him, he'll get you. And this is the same thing he's saying to Cain. He said, why are you furious? He said, if you do what's right, won't you be accepted? But if you don't do what's right, sin is crouching, its desire is for you. In other words, Satan is trying to tempt you. So don't let him. But that's not what happens. In verse 8, it tells us that Cain said to his brother, hey, let's go out to the field. And while they're in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. So the jealousy, the envy, the revenge, the competition, all of it got too much of him. And Satan got within his heart. And he talked to his brother Abel into, hey, let's go out into the field. I'm going to get you away from everybody so nobody will see what I'm about to do. And I'm going to get even with you. And it's ironic because Abel had just shed the blood of an animal to pay for sin and have a sacrificial offering. And now Cain's going to shed his brother's blood in revenge. All right, so God knows what's going on here. But in verse 9, the Lord says to Cain, where is your brother Abel? He already knew. But he says, I don't know. Am I my brother's guardian? As if he's saying, I don't know. Why are you asking me? I'm supposed to look after him too? It's not my business. But verse 10, then he said, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed, alienated from the ground that opens its mouth to receive your brother's blood you have shed. And he pronounces a punishment on him. Something I failed to mention too was that when Cain brought his offering, if you remember back to Adam and Eve, when he gave the punishment to them, he said, the ground is cursed. And so for Cain to bring something that came from the ground, that offering was already contaminated to begin with. So he says here to Cain, I know what you've done. And he asked him though, what have you done? He already knew what he'd done. This was a question of anger. God's upset with him. And he said, what have you done? And well, you've done that with your kids before. You already know they broke the lamp. But you come in and say, what have you done? Because it's calling them to the carpet and saying, all right, you're going to confess what I already know that you have done. So anyway, he says to him, your brother's blood cries out to me. So he puts it right on. I know what you've done. You've killed your brother. And the guilt should be on you. His blood cries out to me from the ground. And he says, now you're cursed, alienated from the ground. I was listening to one guy doing a commentary on this. He said, for people that are farmers, like lifelong farmers, they live that life 24/7. Like farming, that farmland that they inherited from their parents or grandparents, that's family land, and it's precious to them. And to be able to work that land year after year, and they don't have the same type of life as people that don't work that land 24/7. They're worried about that land even when there's nothing planted on it. They're thinking about the next thing they're going to grow in it. When they're away on vacation, they're worried, if they take a vacation, they're worried about what's the next thing they're going to plant. They're always constantly planning around that land. It's their home. That dirt is precious to them because it's what they are. It's who they are. And so look at the punishment he's given to him. He says, you're cursed, you're alienated from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. If you work the ground, it will never again give you its yield. What a horrible thing for a farmer to have to hear. I'm going to work, it's not going to do it anymore. You mean I'm going to plant something that's not going to grow anymore? I mean, that's what a farmer lives for, is to plant. If he puts that seed in the ground, he's thinking, sometime in the near future, I'm going to see the produce that comes from this. So now, he says it's never going to again give you its yield, and you'll be a restless wanderer on the earth. So he takes him away from his land. You're never going to have it anymore, and everything you are is gone. This is the punishment he gets. But Cain answered the Lord and said, my punishment is too great to bear, since you are banishing me from the face of the earth, and I must hide from your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. So God has told him, you're going to be expelled from the land that you knew and the life that you knew. That's the same thing he did to Adam and Eve. You're living in the Garden of Eden, but not anymore. I'm going to expel you from that, because that's your punishment, is you're being banished from the place that I placed you to begin with. So now he calls out to God and says, this punishment is too great. Somebody's going to kill me if they find me, because if they know what I've done, they may do the same thing in return to me. So verse 15, the Lord replied to him, in that case, whoever kills Cain will suffer a vengeance 7 times over. And he placed a mark on Cain so that whoever found him would not kill him. Then Cain went out from, listen to this verse here. Then Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And that phrase, went out from the Lord's presence, is important. because this is the attitude that Cain took from the start. When he brought that offering, he was already out from the Lord's presence, because it was not an humble, honest, sacrificial offering the way Abel's was. Okay, so now look at the mark. The thing about the mark, I've seen little cartoons before where they put an X on their forehead. We don't have any indication that that's what this was. But in some way, he was identified so that he would not be killed by another person. So even in Cain's sin, when he called out to God for some mercy, God still had mercy on him within his sin. So for people that think my life is so full of sin, God's never going to have any mercy on me, I've done too many bad things, here's an indication that God does not withdraw from someone if they call to him. And had Cain lived a life from that day forward that was to honor God, he would have received the same type of blessing of repentance, salvation, faith in God. But he didn't. We have no indication that he did that. And that's what we're going to look at from here forward. And we could talk about some more in that little section. But chapters 4, you start to see Moses writing a contrast between the line of Cain and the line of Seth, who was the next son. So let's read verse 17. Cain was intimate with his wife, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. Now, I know everybody has already asked this question before. Where did Cain get a wife? Because, have you not done that math in your head? Wait a minute. Adam and Eve, we got no girls. Well, if we read over some more, it says that Adam and Eve had more sons than daughters. So in a nutshell, if we just do basic biology here, Cain married one of his sisters. That's about the only way you can explain it. So Cain has a wife, she conceives and gives birth to Enoch. Cain became the builder of a city, and he named the city Enoch after his son. We're already starting to see the type of attitude Cain has. It's, I do what I want to do. I'm going to build for myself. I don't need God. And so he's already been taken. So next one, Arad was named, Arad was born to Enoch. Arad father Mahujael, Mahujael father Methushael, Methushael father Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives for himself. Now here's another one. This man's decided, I'm having 2 wives. So line of Cain is a line of rebellion to God. Let's see, next one. Lamech took 2 wives for himself, one named Ada, the other named Zillah. Ada bore Jabal. He was father of the nomadic herdsmen. His brother was named Jubal. He was father of all who played the lyre and flute. Zillah bore Jubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naaman. Lamech said to his wives, watch this, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, wives of Lamech, pay attention to me. For I killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is to be avenged 7 times over, then for Lamech it'll be 77 times. He just got this raw, mean attitude, and he's killed a guy just for wounding him. So the line of Cain we see is a line that goes against God. Now verse 25. Adam was intimate with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has given me another child in place of Abel, since Cain killed him. A son was born to Seth also, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. Do you see the difference? Cain's line was rebellion, go against God, do what we want to do, kill another person. And when we read about Adam and Eve having Seth, we go a little farther down and we read, at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. So that line is the opposite. That line is seeking to follow God. And when we read on into chapter 5, which we're not going to do, you read about Seth and his descendants, and you read about followed God, worshiped God, walked with God. Enoch, remember, walked with God. You should read that stuff. Noah, same thing, walked with God. That's that line. Okay, so now why are we going to do all that stuff? Because from the time of Genesis 3:15, when that pronouncement was made, that promise was made, that there's going to be hostility between Satan and the woman's seed. That began 2 lines that would go throughout the rest of the Bible. One of them, we know genealogically, you can read in Matthew chapter 1, and it goes name by name all the way to Jesus Christ, generation after generation. And in the Hebrew, actually, the word Genesis means the generations of Adam. In the Greek, Genesis means the beginning. So, but we're reading the generations, and so the line that goes to Jesus is that promised one. Said, I'll have hostility between you and her, and it'll be your offspring versus her offspring. Okay? And so offspring, can mean multiple peoples, but when it finishes up that verse, it says, he will crush you. Remember that? It says, he will crush you, not they, but he, and that he is Jesus. Okay, so the lines go. Now, so you got, starting with Adam, and then, of course, Cain kills Abel, and now you got Seth. And so I'm going to kind of go through some of this and try to explain something that maybe we hadn't noticed before. And that's this fight between these two lines all the way through. Like I said, the line of Jesus is genealogical. It's biological. It is generation to generation. The line of Satan, of the serpent, is not necessarily biological. Because when it gets to Noah's day, remember, the flood wipes out everybody except Noah and his family. So you got Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. That's it. Okay, so all of Cain's descendants died at the flood. So it's not biologically, but the serpent, the Satan, will take over people along history. So let's look at some of this stuff. In 1 John chapter 3, it says, we should not be like Cain, who was the evil one. Okay, so yes, Cain killed Abel, but Satan is who got in Cain's mind and heart and said, kill him. So we have this generations of the serpent offspring. Lamech, we just talked about how he took 2 wives and that he killed a man. And he says, if Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then mine will be 77. See, now you have that. Then the godly offspring, so we had these generations that we're talking about. But throughout all that, the gospel part never changed. That promise was made, and it's carried through all the way to Jesus Christ. And Satan and his offspring had one goal, to try to either exterminate that line or adulterate it in any way possible, contaminate it. And it started with Adam and Eve. I mean, he started from the very first one, said, if I can contaminate these two, then maybe I can just kill God. That didn't work. And God made this promise, so they had 2 kids, Cain and Abel, and he says, all right, how am I going to do this? I'm going to get one of them contaminated, and I'm going to make him kill the other one, and then there's no offspring. So he tried that. Well, that didn't work because Seth was born. And so you go on down. So watch this. Adam's offspring, Seth's offspring. Seth goes all the way, generations, to Noah. Noah's offspring, he had 3 sons. Remember, Shem and Ham and Japheth. Well, Shem's line is the one that goes to Christ. So you got Shem's offspring. That goes all the way to Abraham. Then that goes to Isaac, to Jacob, to Judah, who was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and his offspring would be the one that would lead to Jesus. And then King David, who was told it will come from your line, the promised Messiah. So that's how that goes. And so now, when you look, that's at the beginning of Genesis. Now, if you go all the way to the end of the book, end of the Bible, to Revelations, there's a picture in Revelations that says in Revelation 12:4, the dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. And that's a picture of Mary about to give birth to Jesus Christ, the Messiah. All right, so let's look at how Satan tried to do this along the way. With Cain versus Abel, we've already looked at. He tried to cause people to intermarry godly and godless people before the flood. And that's what happened. You remember before the flood, God said, I can't find anybody else that's pure anymore, that's trying to be holy, that's trying to honor me, except Noah. That's the only one I can find, because all these people who are starting to, these lines that came were idolatrous, going against God, and then they were contaminating everything else. They were starting to intermarry and be idolatrous. So now if you get past the flood, we've got Abraham and Sarah, and of course Abraham's line is promised, but Sarah, remember, she couldn't have a baby. And by miracle of God, she has a son, Isaac. And then Isaac marries Rebekah, and she can't have a baby. And by miracle of God, Jacob and Esau are born. And so go a little further, and we got Pharaoh when the people were in slavery in Egypt, and Pharaoh tried to kill all the boys, tried to wipe them all out. That was an attempt to wipe out the line, and that didn't work. And then if you move forward to King Saul, and King Saul was the first king, and he was in that same time as when the King David came behind, and the serpent Satan got into King Saul. Even though he was a nutcase, he still got in King Saul's mind and says, kill David, because David was part of the line. And then after that, David's line, if you remember, we studied in Kings how the kingdom split. We had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. We've been through this a couple of times. Well, the northern kingdom, they all went the way of the Assyrians. They all started practicing and worshiping other gods. And there's another attempt by Satan to disrupt and to contaminate this whole line to Christ. So you had King Ahab, and y'all remember Jezebel, that name, how mean and wicked she was. Well, she and King Ahab, they had a daughter named Athaliah. We've talked about her before. But Athaliah tried to kill the entire family of King David. Any descendant there was, she wanted them gone. She was evil, yes, but Satan is the one who was trying to get her to do this. And if it weren't for a good priest who hid the baby Josiah until he was about 6 years old and brings him out and says, here's one more from King David's line. And so the line is still preserved. And then move forward, and you got Esther and Mordecai and Haman. And Haman wanted to kill all the Jews, but Queen Esther was a Jew herself, and she, with the help of Mordecai, they saved the Jews and saved the line again. And so you see through history how Satan has tried to contaminate people and use people to go against God and his plan, and to kill that line of the promise to Jesus' offspring that led to Jesus. And even after that, when Jesus comes, King Herod tries to kill all the baby boys again. Says to kill all the boys under 3 years old. And it was all for one thing. They started with Genesis 3:15, but it was all for one thing. Make sure that baby is not born, and if he is born, make sure he does not die on the cross. Make sure he's not a sacrifice. Somehow keep him from that cross. Somehow keep him from dying for people's sins, because that was going to be the thing that would crush Satan's head. Okay? So even after Jesus is born, we got Jesus tempted in the wilderness by Satan. We've got him Satan poisoning Peter's words that we just talked about. We got it going into Judas's heart and betraying Jesus. We've got him contaminating, corrupting all the Jewish leaders, Caiaphas and Pilate and Annas. Remember those guys that just before Jesus was crucified? And then when there's nothing left, Satan says, fine, kill him. Because he knows that's the last shot. If I could just kill him, then maybe he won't come back to life. Maybe that'll be the end of it. But because Jesus rose from the dead, Satan was killed over it. Now, the end of it is Satan's destruction. And that's when you find over in Revelations where it says he'll be defeated. The great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He's thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. That's in Revelation 12:9. But when you see, I hope that I haven't confused you to pieces, but going through the Bible history and looking at where this first thing happened with Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel, the very first murder, it started at a line and a conflict that went through thousands of years of Satan trying his best to wipe out the line of Christ, to make sure that Jesus was not born. And we got multiple times that we just talked about there where it got down to one person. I mean, Josiah was the last one. If Josiah's killed, the line's gone. If those baby boys in Egypt, if they weren't preserved somehow, then the line's gone. I mean, you just see over and over, and yeah, we point out those names, but it's Satan behind all of it. He's behind every one of them, trying to get in their hearts and corrupt them and contaminate them. And it's still happening today. I mean, Satan has decided, hey, fine, I'm going to get what I'm going to get. Some of them are going to go to heaven, but I'm going to take just as many as I can down. And that's why when you look at people today, so why do people act that way? Or why are people evil? Because they're listening more to Satan than they are listening to God. And Satan's trying his best every day to just be after people, to get in their hearts and minds, and contaminate them, adulterate them, make them think everything's okay. And we could look at more things about how Satan is trying to just destroy life any way possible. I think about abortion. I mean, that's just okay. He is totally obsessed with killing babies, because that's a reminder of him, of Jesus being born to him. As Jesus was born as a baby, the Messiah, the one that was going to be the one that would crush him, born as a baby. So he says, fine, I'll take out just as many babies as I can. And so Satan is after destroying any life possible. And it's a battle that is going to go on and on and on until he's thrown into hell and locked away forever. So look at how Christians are treated today. Satan hates us. He hates people who stand up for God. He despises. He doesn't like the Jews, because that generation, that nationality is the one that led to Jesus Christ's birth. So he hates the Jews. Look at the anti-Semitism we got all over the world. And we've had to deal with this back in the 40s with Hitler, and now we're dealing with some of it again today. The people that look on God's chosen nation says they need to be wiped out for good. And you just look at how Satan's rebellion against God has been able to contaminate humankind. And it started here with Adam and Eve, but we see the first thing today with Cain and Abel. And it was their two attitudes, the way they came to God, is what set them apart. Because Cain came with a selfish heart. Right after that, when Cain goes out, he starts to build that city. Names it after his son, and if you don't remember too far, you got the Tower of Babel and everything, where they're trying to build temples to themselves, and we're going to do what we get ready. And Abel's line, Seth's line was different, because it talks about how they honored God, they walked with God. And so you see the two differences there. They're contrasted really well in chapter 4 and even into chapter 5. And next week, as we move a little forward, we start getting into that time period between Seth and Noah, where people started to intermarry, and it started to become, the earth started to become a place that was not following God, because some were. The line of Seth was, but some weren't, because they were getting mixed up with Cain and his people. And by the time it gets to Noah, there's nobody left. And God says, I have no choice but to wipe everything out and start over again. And he said, Noah's the only one that had stayed true to what Adam and Eve were. And that's why he was chosen. We'll get into that next week, but hope I didn't blow minds. That's stuff I had never heard before, but by getting a big picture, it helps us to see what Cain and Abel, what place they play in all this, but where Satan fits into it too, by trying to exterminate Jesus Christ. And even though Jesus Christ was born, lived, died, resurrected, and is in heaven, Satan's still even now trying to contaminate us, trying to contaminate anyone who would follow Jesus or even turn to him. Questions or comments? There's a lot there. Anybody? Had you ever put all that line together like that before? That's stuff you never. It's hard to fit all that in one lesson, So, so much there. All right, let's pray. Kevin, pray for us.
Service, worship power, Lord, as we can as He brings us a message. Forgive us our sins and any way we fall short.